All right. Hey, everybody. So today we'll be talking through JupyterDash. It's just one way that you can level up your EDA. If you feel like you want to take the data that you're using and present it in a nice interactive way, you can do that. So JupyterDash is basically a Jupyter notebook version of a dashboard. I'll scroll down here to show you an example of what it looks like. So this is an example of a JupyterDash. I'm going to talk through how you make this specific one. And this is actually the one from their documentation. So really cool. You can have all these drop-down things. And this data set is basically indicators for a bunch of different countries. So for example, I want to look at the relationship between fertility rate and life expectancy at birth for a bunch of different countries. Here you'll see that each data point refers to a country, life expectancy, fertility rate. I can also look at different years metrics. You can see 1992 to 2007. You can pick the years from here. And also when you hover, you actually see the time series on the right side of, historically, this indicator for that specific country. So this, doesn't only work for this kind of data. This works for pretty much any data that you want. If your data is, I think, as long as you want to showcase a lot of, if you want to showcase your data in a nice way, I highly, highly recommend JupyterDash. There's a little bit of a learning curve, so I'm going to point you all to like what the main things are. Feel free to take this code, but this code does come from their documentation as well. Feel free to take this code and implement it with your own data. But these graphs might look a little bit familiar because JupyterDash is, Jupyter version of Dash, which is actually created by Plotly, which is that other plotting library that I've mentioned a few times. I know it's not part of our curriculum, but I personally use Plotly the most because of this interactive element. I think it's on the 3rd or 4th week I put on our calendar. I'm going to walk through making front ends for your project. And eventually, if you'd like, you can actually take your JupyterDash and put it onto a web page. And I'll show you all some examples where you can host them for free. So you can actually give someone a URL and they can see the dashboard that you've made. That I'll talk about in a few weeks, but first you have to build this. And I do think that if you do intend on building some sort of dashboard eventually, it's always good to start building it in JupyterDash first, because Jupyter is a much easier place to debug and figure out what's going on. All right, so to start, JupyterDash is the package that makes it very easy to develop Plotly Dash apps from the Jupyter Notebook, and also compatible with Jupyter Lab. So if anyone uses Jupyter Lab, you can run JupyterDash in Jupyter Lab as well. So I'll talk about this Dash class when we talk about actual Dash, which is the actual website version of this. So we will talk about this right now. If you want to make a dashboard, you first have to know your data, because if not, it'll be very, very hard to, as you're learning about your data, create your dashboard. So very likely you'll be doing your standard static EDA before you turn it into a dashboard. So some important things that will definitely help is first design your dashboard. Think about the layout and what Dash core components you want to use. Let me open this and I'll talk about this in a little bit. But basically a core component is a component of your dashboard. So the Plotly Dash library is organized in a way that you can basically pick components for your dashboard. So in this example, a component is a drop-down list. That's one component. This drop-down list is another component. These radio items, I think these are called radio items. This is a component as well. Each graph is a component. This slider tool is also a component. So before you even start coding out your dashboard, know your data, think about what data you want to showcase, and literally draw it out. Like I always have a whiteboard next to me where I write my notes, and I will draw out my dashboards before I start coding them. And that's going to be extremely, extremely helpful, because it's easier to build something off a plan than starting to figure out layouts from scratch while you're coding. So figure out your layout first, and then also think about what components interact with what. Now that's a little bit more abstract, especially now since this is the first time we're talking about dashboards. But what I mean by that is what changes in components lead to changes in other components. So for example, I know that if I were to change the value here, this graph, and this graph will update. If I change this component over here, like from linear to log, it seems that this one and then this one will update as an example. So think about all the things that will change as a result of a value changing in one component. It can be pretty hard to map out. I know when the last dashboard I was making had like 15 different components interacting with each other, and I literally had to draw it on like a mind map and give them all like very specific ID names so I don't get confused and say, all right, this change will lead to a change in these 5 different places. So map those out first, because it's going to be very, very helpful when you actually start to implement. Cool. So in this example, and this is the example pulled from JupyterDash's documentation. Oh, before that, let me show you some core components. There are a lot of different ones. Dash's documentation is actually also written in Dash. So anything that you see here, you can actually code in Dash, which is cool. So as a few examples, core components are the main ones. You can see that there are a few, and let me change this so it's not in dark mode. Dark mode is a little hard to see. All right, so as an example, let's say you're doing time series data. You can actually do date picker. So I used this one recently as well. As you know, as I told some of you, I'm working with financial data. So I was looking at different time periods. So client wanted me to be able to like select different dates. So you can select starting date, end date, and plot whatever the time series is. So that's something that you can do. There's also a download button, which is really cool. You guys probably wouldn't need to use the download button. Drop down lists, as I talked about before, you can have different drop downs. You can also have it, drop down list will actually auto fill in Dash. So for example, let me see if there's an example here. So let's say I want to pick Montreal, it'll auto complete there, which is very neat. You can have different kinds of drop downs. This is a multi drop down selector. So let's say you're doing like a sports project and you want to see, you want to compare a bunch of different players. You can actually have this kind of drop down, and for every player you want to see their stats as an example. You can build something like this. You can compare different players. That's pretty cool. You can have it clear. Let's see, what else is there? You can actually have regular text input. So if you're doing NLP and you want it to take in like a raw tweet or a raw text or something, you can actually just have like a text box where you can give it input. Let me look for a cleaner example. I guess here you can just have it take in text. You can have it take in a number. I don't know what these are, but yeah, different formats as well. A bunch of other things. Radio items, that's the one where you have like the little thing over here. Oops, we can do over here. Range sliders, if you want to look for ranges of numbers. The actual sliders is similar to like the year that we had before. This one is labeled with temperatures. And if you want to get a little bit more complicated, you can actually have different tabs for dashboards. If you want to have like one dashboard that shows maybe summary statistics and then one dashboard that shows more granular statistics, you can actually do that. Tab 1, tab 2, and then you build out whatever graphs that you want. So a lot of different components that you can pick from here. There's a lot. There's also like data tables. Data tables are basically like if you want to just showcase some summary data in like a mini table, you can do that. There's a lot within Dash. Any questions on any of this stuff? I think at this point, I don't think anyone is on their way to making a dashboard like this or next week. That's typically something that you do towards the end of your EDA phase at the earliest. Okay. Back to our notebook. So what I'm importing here, I'm importing JupyterDash, and then I'm using everything out of the Dash library. So here's JupyterDash, but pretty much all of this code that I'm going to talk about, when you want to go from JupyterDash to web page Dash, it's pretty much copy and paste this entire thing. So I'll explain what that process looks like in a few weeks. But for now, I'm going to be using some core components, which are literally the components on the dashboard, as well as HTML components. I'll talk about some HTML components in a bit too, and we're just going to use pandas to see our data. If you're using either Jupyter Hub or Binder, you got to add this. I have never used either of these. But okay, the data that we're going to use is a bunch of countries indicator data, as I mentioned before. So we have almost 37,000 rows of data with country, indicator, year, and the value. So from this, I'm just gonna, within the code, filter out specific countries, specific years, specific indicators, and display them on the dashboard. Cool. Now, there are several components to building a dashboard. So first there's the layout, or actually, yeah, let's talk about that first. First, there's the layout, and then there are the callbacks. So the layout literally will say where everything is placed on your app. And then the callbacks are basically what defines, if I make one change here, this is going to change as well. And the callbacks are honestly what I spend most of my time debugging because it's a little bit annoying. But yeah, I'll talk through that in a little bit. So to start, let's talk about layout. This looks a little bit intimidating. I fully agree with that. But it is basically nested divs. So divs might sound familiar because divs is what is how HTML code is written in, I guess. I don't know. I'm not super familiar with HTML myself. But that's why we're using the HTML components from Dash, because it allows us to represent our components in HTML. So as you can see here, we have a couple different sections. So I've added a bunch of comments to kind of tell you what each part is. So as an example, here, this is the left side. And the thing about divs is that anything within a div goes top to bottom, and they pretty much always stack on top of each other. So here, this code from here to here, this div here, and you can see that the indentations match the nesting of the divs. And I know this is super confusing for now, but spend some time staring at it if you do want to work with this. But this entire div determines the top part of our dashboard. So this div refers to these 4 components over here. So we have this dropdown, this radio item, and this radio item. So that is everything that's highlighted here. So let me break this down. We'll go from big to small. So this whole thing is that top bar. We won't even go to the code for a little bit. And then you can see here that within this large div, there are kind of 2 divs within it. So HTML div, there's one here, and this is the left side, and then this is the right side. How you know which is left and which is right is because within each div, and let me zoom in, hopefully this is not too confusing. So this is the bigger div, and this is the smaller one. You can see that this div ends here. So here we have this style argument. And you're basically saying, okay, we're just going to force this to be 49% of the width. That's what this is all about. So with 49% of the width, that kind of pushes everything to the left, such that when we have our right side div, you can see that the width is 49% and this one floats to the right. So that's how you get 2 components on the left, 2 components on the right. This is a syntax that took me way too long to figure out what was going on and how I get things side by side. That's how you do it. There is actually a slightly easier way to do this that is newer, and I'll show you that in a few weeks. Okay, so as I mentioned, within each div, things go up to down. So here, within this left side div, or actually this left side div, we have 2 Dash core components. And Dash core components are represented by DCC because we do import Dash core component as DCC. So over here, you can see that we have our 2 components. We have our dropdown and we have our radio items. Now, I actually really am a fan of the Dash documentation because they have a lot of examples and it's very, very clear how to use each component. So let's go to dropdown as an example, since that's the first one that we see. All right, so with dropdown, you can see that the main things, let me get to the properties. These are all of the different properties that you can add. They have a lot of examples for different kinds of dropdowns. So feel free to read through the examples, but for this one, we're just going to do a single value dropdown. So for example, a default dropdown just looks like this. So all you're giving it is you have to give it an ID, Now, the IDs are very, very important that you remember what each component's ID is, because when you're doing the callbacks, this is what comes back to haunt you. So there's the ID, the options for your drop-down list, and this is a dictionary. I'll show you how I set it up later. And then you have to have a value, and the value is basically the starting value. When you start up your dashboard, do you want it to start at a certain value? Cool. So same thing that we see here with this DCC dropdown, we have an ID. And this is a cross-filter x-axis column is what they decided to call it. And in terms of options, we did a dictionary comprehension of label and value in a dictionary. And each option is going to be a dictionary that looks like this. That's because this value is what will be used later, and label is what shows up. So for example, if you had a bunch of dummy variables that are like label encoded, not dummy variables. Let's say you have like a variable that's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But on your dashboard, you don't want it to show up as 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Maybe you want to give them like specific names. That's when you'll be like, okay, label 0, value, sorry, label name, value 0, label other name, value 1. Hopefully that makes sense. So here I'm doing it for I and available indicators. And in available indicators is basically a list that we've determined from this data frame over here. So that's how this knows to pull the options. That's how it knows what the options are. And then this value of fertility rate total births per woman, that's basically the default value. So when I first started up this dashboard, the first indicator that comes up, and actually let me see if I can run this again. What comes up is fertility rate total births per woman. So that's a drop-down component. And a lot of the other components work very, very similarly. So for the radio items, you see that you're giving it another ID, but instead of like a column, you're giving it type. Same, instead of different values, we only needed to have linear log. So we're going to say for I and linear log. If I wanted to have a third option and say, I don't know, exponent as an example, you rerun this, rerun this, rerun this, you'll see that now I have an exponent option here. So just an example to see how you can add options for these things. So this is these two components. For the left side is actually exactly the same, but instead it's y-axis column, y-axis type. It's extremely important that none of your IDs have the same name because I think your dashboard won't even run, and it's very, very difficult to debug if that's an issue. So on the right side is the same. We have our drop down as well as radio items. And then this style here, notice that this is the style for the right side div, but this is the style for the outer div for both the left and right. And this is what determines the background color to be that like gray color. So that's how we see that this entire div up here has a slightly different color. So far we've talked about just this top bar over here. Does anyone have any questions? Cool. Yeah, not for this session, but for when I talk about front ends, I'm going to send you all a zip file to your Slack channel where you can download. And that's basically a bunch of templates of front ends that you can definitely take. Those are all my old projects, so feel free to take them and like edit them to make them your own. So that'll be a little bit easier versus starting from scratch. Okay, so we've talked about these top parts. Next, let's talk about the graphs. So from here, let me zoom back out again. So this is all the top stuff. This houses the 3 graphs. So what we have here, you can sort of see that there are two, again, there are 2 divs here. So hold on, let me double check. Oh, there's one div here and then one div here for the left and right. So this is the left side one where we have a graph, and this is the graph with like the hover data for each country. So it's a cross-filter scatter plot. So this refers to this thing over here, this graph over here. So that's that. And then on the right side, we have the 2 graphs, the 2 graphs of the X time series and the Y time series. And then you can see that we have the width 49 and the width 49 as well. So that's how they become side by side. Now notice that at this point, I'm not really telling it what to graph yet. because that comes in when we do our app callback, which we'll get to in a little bit. But at this point, we are just saying that, okay, there's just going to be a graph here. And these are just like placeholders. So here you can see I'm just doing DC.graph. The only thing I'm telling it at the very start is what the ID is and if I want to have any starting values. And here I'm starting with Japan as an initial value. So here is just an ID. For these graphs, the time series line graphs on the right side, these are also placeholders to start. And then the very last thing in this dashboard is a slider for the year, basically what's at the very bottom here. This is its own div actually. And if we look over here, we're just defining a slider. It has its own ID again. We're going to take the minimum and maximum year that exists in that data frame, start with the maximum year, and then for the marks, we'll look for the string for year in df year.unique. So every unique year will have its own marker. And then you can actually define the steps, I think. I forget what this means. If I do step equal to 1, let's see what happens. All right. I guess see how like the steps equal to 1, meaning that at specific years, nothing will show up because I put step equal to 1. Instead, what I should do is step equal to 5, but step equal to none just means that it will go to only the values that exist. All right, let's save this for later. Any questions at this point about setting up a layout? Based on this, you can see why it's important that you plan out what you want your dashboard to look like first before you even start coding this out. And it helps to think about your dashboard in terms of like sections as well. Like, especially like up to down, top to bottom sections. Like, all right, this top section will be all of my toggles. This bottom section will be all of my graphs as an example. Later after this, I'm going to stop the recording and I'll show you one of the dashboards that I've most recently made. I've showed some of you already, but because it's like company data, I can't put it on this recording, but I'll show you all that in a little bit after I end this recording. Cool. Okay, so next we're going to talk about callbacks, and callbacks are basically what allows different components to interact with each other. So let's first think about let's see, 1, 2, 3 different callbacks. All right, so there's 3 different callbacks here. Let's start with this big one. And this is the scatter plot callback, because we know that based on different values for different components, my scatter plot will look a different way. So first, what affects the scatter plot? From here, you can see that there are 5 inputs. And anytime you see anything with like a little @ sign above a function, that's known as a decorator. I haven't gone into like technically how a decorator works, but you just need that. So here you can see that there are 5 inputs. That's because for our scatter plot, 5 different components affect our scatter plot. Let me just go to something that makes sense. So the dropdown affects it. This radio item affects it. Oh, exponent works too. That's cool. This dropdown and this radio item, as well as this slider. So these 5 components affect this scatter plot. So when I begin to define the callback in this decorator, you have to define what the inputs and the outputs are. So, okay, the output is that scatter plot, and this has to match the ID of the scatter plot. So cross filter indicator scatter matches cross filter indicator scatter. And then the inputs also have to match. So you have cross filter column, the type, those are the radio items, and the sliders. Now, the second argument here is where you're getting the information from. So you know that when we output our scatter plot, it outputs a figure. So that's pretty straightforward. Usually if you're updating a graph, it outputs figure. From here, we're actually pulling the values from each of these. And how you know that this is value and why you have to put value, not something else. Let me see if there are any other examples. Yeah, here you can see that there's hover data. I'll talk about that in a little bit. But here we know it's value because, let's see, what's a good example here? We know that there is an argument within the dropdown that is value, and that's going to be what information the callback is going to take from there. So at this point, it knows it's going to take the whatever value this is. And then within this callback is when you actually graph it out. So here we have our, oh, before I get into that, we have to set it up as a function. And you'll see here that I have five inputs, and these 5 inputs match the same order as these inputs. So x-axis column name comes from here, y-axis column name comes from here, x and y-axis type comes from these two, and then year value comes from the slider. So these arguments must match the order of how you define the inputs. And then here you're just using these values to update your data frame and plot your graph. So here you'll see a lot of filtering of the data frame because we're getting the specific indicator, you're getting specific country, and then you plot your scatter plot here. This is Plotly code. So the code over here is traditional Plotly code. You can use Plotly Express as well. I know some of you have played around with some Plotly graphs. You can use Plotly Express as well. All right. I know this is very confusing. I think it really takes like hands-on work to understand what this is. I'll tell you all that when Flatiron School first started their data science program, this was our phase 1 project to create a dashboard. And so it's extremely traumatizing, but I've learned a lot about dashboards because of that. So I've had to like hands-on on this. I like thought I was not going to pass this program, but yeah. Any like immediate questions about this? I don't expect questions about this. I know there's a lot going on here. Okay, so let's talk about one more callback because these other two are the same. This updates the y time series, updates the x time series. At anywhere, you can actually define other helper functions. So for example, this is a helper function that that helps to create those line graphs. And that just means that because the 2 line graphs down here are kind of created the same way, you don't have to have that repetitive code. So you can create helper functions throughout the notebook, throughout the cell. So here what's happening is we're outputting, based on the hover data, we're outputting different line graphs. So things that will affect each line graph are the indicator and whether it's linear or log, and also what you're hovering over. So here you can see that instead of value, this takes in hover data because this kind of scatter plot will actually take note of what you're hovering over to use that to feed in to filter out specific country of which to plot the data for. So because of that, that's why we say hover data. And you can sort of guess that, and honestly, it will take a good bit of trial and error. You kind of guess that because from the scatter plot, which was here, we had that argument called hover data. So from that, we're just grabbing the 3 inputs again, 3 inputs over here. Therefore, we have 3 arguments in the function here. And then we just define, and we're using the create time series function here that was used here to help create that graph. And it's pretty much the same thing for the other line plot as well. So these 2 are pretty much identical. All right, finally, to run, there are a couple lines of code. Here, there's app.run server. If you're doing just run server with no mode inline is basically what allows it to show up in a cell in a notebook. If it's just run server, you can actually open this in a new tab and it will show up on a web page, and it'll actually give you a good idea of what it will look like on a website. So you can debug it like that as well. Let me close this. And then if you're on JupyterLab, you can just do mode equal JupyterLab. And I believe those are the main mediums that y'all will use to do this. So yeah, that is a dashboard. I will say, I don't expect you all to have dashboards for this capstone project, but it could be something that you work on and play with after graduation. That's what some students have done. I've spent so many hours debugging dashboards, so I'm more than happy to help debug yours too if you need any help with that. But with that, any questions with regards to this in general? After this, I'm going to stop the recording and I'll show you all like a much more complex dashboard that I built for a project. All right, cool. Let me stop the recording here.